and the topic of decolonizations are rising, we're also witnessing a clear statement on Palestine, on the current situation in academia and in media in Germany, North America, and in general in the Western media. Is that right? Do you see it that way as well, or?
Yes, like compared to other instances where Gaza, for example, was under attack as well. And that, of course, paralleled with the, machineries of expulsion and subjugation that is practiced against Palestinian people by the Israeli state, has seldom been approached, I think, here in Germany. And there's the Palestinian question is still a taboo to, has been, I'm hopeful now, but it has been until up to this point, very much a taboo subject. And I feel like now we're witnessing people being more vocal, and there's an increase in allies to Palestinians. And personally, I feel like this is perhaps because what was happening in Palestine this time was actually documented, real time by people who were there, they're from there, and they were actually also talking about, speaking the international language of solidarity now, so that people now could understand that solidarity with Palestinian people is also a solidarity with so many more movements. And even like the Black Lives Matter would issue a statement in solidarity. And I just feel like a lot of institutes that, perhaps would consider themselves apolitical, like art institutes or academic institutes, now have really grasped the importance of having a very clear stance and, translating that through a statement with the Palestinian people. So yeah, like the short answer is yes, I do.
Okay, I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to mention for the audience that this session is going to be recorded, so just keep that in mind.
Sure.
Yeah. Leah, what would be your take on that?
Yeah, I think the influx and popularity of the post-colonial studies movement is beginning to see its impact on public discourse when it comes to Palestine, but I don't think it's fully been realized. I'm not quite an academic myself, but I certainly have seen in more academic and more politically active and politicized circles, particularly in public fora like social media, there's beginning to be a shift in the framing of Palestine to understand that Palestinians have actually been enduring 73 years of occupation, of colonialism, of ethnic cleansing, and that this project is one of settler colonialism and not this protracted, inexplicable war as it's been framed by the mainstream media for a long time. And so I begin to see that shift happening to a colonial framework of Palestine when it comes to how the Western world views the situation, but I don't think we've fully realized it, particularly not in fully in the academic sphere and certainly not in the mainstream media narratives. And at least speaking from a North American and US perspective, we're miles from that, we're, so far from that when it comes to political conversation and political dialogue and what we see our officials, saying in the public sphere. But I do think, when it comes to personal conversations, the post-colonial movement has really moved the needle on Palestine in a way that, I think a lot back to 2014 when the attacks on Gaza were happening 7 years ago. And obviously there have been attacks since, but that massive barrage in 2014, I think in the US was, the conversation was so different than it has been in 2021. I think a lot of the credit for that is due to, as Sanabel was saying, the solidarity movements globally that have pushed Western conversations on colonialism, pushed, Western mainstream media and academia to understand legacies of oppression, of racism, and, beginning to shift towards decolonization and justice. And so I see the influence of the work that groups like Black Lives Matter, different Indigenous liberation groups have done to sort of push the public sphere are definitely showing their impact on the conversations in Palestine, but I don't think we're quite at the stage of fully understanding, at least in the media and academia in the Western world, Palestine as a colonial entity, but I do think we're getting closer.
Okay, it's interesting that you say that. And I would also want to ask Sanabel again, since we were also now talking about the responsibility of intellectuals. Noam Chomsky, for example, talked about the correlation between intelligence and morality, and that there could also be, it could also be a little bit problematic, especially because, for example, superiors might also benefit from the intelligence, since people often mostly trust their interests instead of their own than in themselves. What I mean with that is also that they might fear of their reputation, because like in our studies and in our field, I would say it's especially important to take a stance on that, and we learn a lot about Fanon and post-colonial studies. But when it comes to positioning yourself, I think there is still some sort of reluctance. Do you also see that, or do you think that it's a really open discourse so far?
Yeah, no, absolutely, there is. And I also don't think it's kind of an underlying reason. I think it's a very direct one, because because I think what people, a lot of people, including some academics, do not want to confront is that even academia is policed. The political correctness, it's out there in the public space, but it's very much alive in the academic sphere as well. And I feel that, a lot of academics are really aware of the fact that if they break that taboo of, not talking about Palestine for, a reason or another, and of course in Germany, this is, it comes at a much bigger scale, they know that there will be something that they're going to lose. And they know there's actually even more to gain by adopting the opposing viewpoint. And I think like some of the most important accounts on this very particular subject, and specifically on the idea of, Palestine and talking about Palestine, was addressed very directly by Edward Said. And, his texts, to talk about, like, for example, representations of the intellectual, he talks about how the intellectuals, the academics in the West are, expected to talk, behave, or even their viewpoints. And I feel like for academics, sometimes they kind of take this easy route of saying, I want to stay out of politics. But even this is not accurate, because academia and politics have always been wedded together, even in colonial projects. There is a book by Eric Lindstrom, published in 2016, actually, very recently, and it's called Empire Dreams: Psychology of Ruling an Empire, I think. And basically, he goes into detail about how the British Empire attempted to study the dreams of all the people it colonized, so that they can better control and subjugate them, because they wanted to penetrate even the area of like the dream space of the people they colonized, so that they will be able to better control them. And they did that through sending academics and professors of psychology. So this has always existed. But I feel right now, the question of Palestine, because it's so sensitive to, I'm talking, for example, of course it applies to in America, but I'm talking mostly here in Germany, because of so many reasons. And I feel like it's also the academic's role and to really confront this and to attempt to talk about it. Because I feel like just even talking about it, even talking about the subject is still very much something that academics fear. And, and I feel like this is what really, distinguishes between, this is what makes distinct between and solidarity and all of that. And, academics who want to stay on the safe side and kind of study what's already been established for personal gain, And of course, I'm not, saying that everyone should risk everything to talk about Palestine, but if we don't do that, it's never going to happen. So yeah, definitely.
Yeah, Leah, could you give us some insights about how the situation is in that regard at the different universities in the US? And also, like, a typical argument would be against speaking up, against having a position, that there are those scientific fundamentals like neutrality, objectivity, independence, and that's why you should kind of stay in your ivory tower and do your research, but not speak up. So what would you tell someone who says something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing I'll really credit the global BDS movement to challenging this component on academia and its role in perpetuating the colonization of Palestine. I mean, as Sanabel said, the academics have always played a role in colonial, entities and conquests, and I think it's for that reason and pointing to that history that we can sort of debunk some of these ideas about neutrality, objectivity, and I think as I was saying, the BDS movement has an arm, as many of you are probably aware, for the cultural and academic boycott, and this was something actually that in a past life as a student organizer, we took up. And really critiqued and looked at the exchange that was happening between University of Haifa and our college, because that exchange was not through the lens of post-colonial studies at all, but rather more a propaganda trip to learn about why Israel was so great and all of these things. And in order to have those conversations on campus, we really did encounter a lot of what you're saying, Darius, about the people who come from more of a traditional scientific fundamental background of saying we need to weigh two equal sides, we need to be objective, quote unquote. But this is where I really see, like I said, both the BDS movement and the post-colonial studies perspective really debunking and kind of dissolving the validity of that argument, because in any colonial entity, you're not dealing with two balanced powers wherein, hearing both sides provides you with more context and understanding of what's happening on the ground. When we understand Palestine to be in the colonial context and framework, then we understand that colonizers and all of the institutions that have been built up to protect a colonial entity are going to perpetuate racist mythologies about the colonized peoples, in this case, Palestinians. And part of that project is actually delegitimizing the ability of Palestinians to speak on their own experiences and their own, lived experiences as the indigenous population to historic Palestine. So I think there's a lot that goes into kind of this perpetuation of this like fantasy where you can put an Israeli speaker and a Palestinian speaker in the same room and come to some sort of academic integrity through that conversation and through that dialogue, which is actually quite at odds with both Palestinians' lived experience and understanding of the context on the ground, and also with how we understand colonialism existing throughout history. And on the point of how to kind of break through that just blatantly like racist mythology and understanding of Palestine, I think the analogies between the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa and Palestine can really give us a lot of context to see how we could move forward on this. During the anti-apartheid movement and the BDS movement that was against the apartheid in South Africa, really the genius of activists was to make apartheid an issue that no one could be neutral on. And what they really did was actually take the idea of neutrality off of its pedestal and make it very clear that everyone, including academics, had a stand on apartheid, whether they saw themselves to or not. Everyone was taking a stand either by being complicit with apartheid or by being active against it. And so that's, I think, the shift in framing that the BDS movement coming out of Palestine is creating, and that post-colonial studies is also furthering. But I think we still do have a ways to go in order for that to be fully realized. But I think beginning to unlink, decouple, and kind of dismantle these ideas about neutrality and objectivity, and really understanding how that historically in all colonial contexts they've actually perpetuated racist mythologies and actually don't help get a clear understanding of what's really happened in Palestine for the last 73 years.
Okay. Sabri, you want to go on?
Yeah, sure. So very interesting. So do you think that that we need more voices in, especially in the discourse of academia? It seems for me that there's a lack of new Edward Said, since Sanabel, you mentioned Edward Said so far. Or do you think this is so much represented in that case, or?
I think, of course, there's many Edward Saids. It's just the idea that they're not really given the opportunity that they deserve and the space that they need. And I think what's most dangerous about, Leo was just talking about it, about how not taking a stance is kind of in itself taking a stance, to be silent about that. And I feel like right now, this thing is, people are becoming aware that being silent on this will mean that in 50 years, they will remember that they were silent on this, which is, something we don't want to happen in 50 years. So, Edward Saids are there, but they're not given space. And even if I look at, the University of Toronto, where I graduated from, is doing horribly as an academic institute. It's very. There's a professor. Sorry, her name escapes me. Dr. Valentina Azarova, and she was supposed to take on a position in the International Human Rights Program at the University of Toronto. But once they found out that she had links with, she was vocal about Palestine. She was rejected, and she was not giving that position. And right now, it's a big, it's a big conversation happening at the University of Toronto. And even at the University of Toronto, for example, you have the Monk School of Public Affairs, where they do these exchange programs, and they send students from Canada to occupied places in Palestine and annexed areas to teach them about coexistence. So the ways in which this is done is extremely colonial. It's very colonialist in its very it's in the premise itself. And I think it goes back to what Leo was saying about kind of equating both sides when they are not equal, for many reasons. Of course, the whole settler colonial dynamic is, of course, the main one that's at play here. But I just hope that right now what we have is a small window, that allows scholars who are vocal about Palestine to actually be seen, be heard, and without getting punished and penalized, because this is what's happening. You've got this this witch hunt of people who talk about Palestine and who dare to humanize Palestinians. And I feel like right now Germany needs to confront the fact that it cannot sweep everything under the rug. This has been happening for 73 years. And now you have some of the biggest human rights organizations, including Israeli ones, saying that this is a form of apartheid, that this is settler colonialism at play. People use the term genocide. But of course, later they're, policed and they're attacked, so they kind of tone it down. But this is a conversation that needs to be had. And in academia, again, because I discussed the role of the academic, this is at the forefront. I mean, especially academics of, Middle Eastern history. And in a text I wrote, I call this like a toxic flanneurship, because you just have scholars, going to the cities of the Middle East, trying food, learning Arabic, making friends and all of that. And most importantly, writing about the Middle East, creating knowledge about the Arabs, and the Palestinians. And then when this happens, they just, turn away like, this does not concern me. But it does, the whole knowledge that you've built, the whole discourse that you're kind of trying to push onto people has been created on the backs, of Palestinians and other Arabs. So this needs to be acknowledged, So yeah, I think, I'm hopeful about this, but hopefully the space will, will grow bigger.
Yeah, so thank you very much. To wrap up this topic, kind of. So what's the current situation of the universities in this regard? Because historically, it's already kind of a cliche that revolutions broke out and started at the universities. And now, is it still that place with this potential, or is it like the opposite, like maintaining the status quo and keeping things like they are always have been, like a really conservative place? Where would you see them?
I think it's changing, but it's not changing because of the people who are in power. But I think it's changing because the students who are coming into university, the students who are now growing to become professors and teachers, are using their own positionality, and they're using their own experience. So I feel like in the future, we will see this again. Like you said, universities becoming these hotspots for, speaking against power, what Edward Said always talks about, because he recognized this. He recognizes it fully, that you have things to lose when you are in that position of power and you speak against them. And against people who are happy being, complicit in all of this. But I really have hope that later, once you have these generations graduating and teaching, then this will open up. But of course, this doesn't mean it's going to happen automatically. There needs to be a lot of pressure of people in power who are actively, silencing students and, faculty who are trying to, talk about this topic. And something I noticed, and I feel like is actually, very important, the signing of petitions. And to be honest, I was always a bit, pessimistic about that. I didn't think it had a lot of potential for change. But now the fact that you see, some big scholars' names signing this petition, of course, supporting people talking about Palestine or issuing a statement of solidarity. And then we have students writing similar petitions against their universities so that they can kind of push the boundaries that they've, trapped them in. I feel carries a lot of hope. And I'm very happy always seeing those go around. So I think with this kind of continuing, then things will inevitably change. And I feel like a lot of people might be like holding on so strongly right now with not changing their mind. But I think it's just a matter of time till people really understand what's happening, and that what's happening is absolutely horrible.
And I'll just add that I think one of the reasons that academia has been a holdout on the issue of Palestine is because there is a revolutionary history of universities being hotbeds for progressive thought and for change for social justice. And that's something that, the pro-Israel and the Zionist movement is very aware of and actually has targeted specifically. So I think another thing that's important to just say as we're wrapping up this conversation is that this is particularly as I think about the US context, this is not simply a product of academia being the way academia is. This is actually the product of, decades of laws, policies, and institutional, lobbying essentially and biasing towards Zionism, such that speaking out on Palestine has become untenable in university spaces. So like if we think about the American context, there has been bill after bill in states across the United States to essentially criminalize speech of Palestinians, speech of anyone who speaks to humanize Palestinians and their fight for freedom. All of that has been cast under anti-Semitism with this, really dangerous conflation of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. And that's very intentional on the behalf of people looking to defend Israel's behavior and colonization of Palestinians. There has been really an intentional effort to silence the Palestinian perspective and to criminalize it, actually. So we see that happening in the US, and universities have been the target of those policies for a long, long time, because there is such a history of students speaking out. We, again, think of the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, think of the Black Power movement in the US in the mid 20th century. All of those movements for freedom and justice, the Latin American solidarity movement, again, in the 1980s, all of those things had locuses of power at universities. And so that's something that's very threatening to a colonial entity. And so for that reason, I think academia has been such a target for suppression of free speech and of activism, and why it's become so toxic, as Sanabel said. But I think we will, as you were just saying, hit a critical mass where that shifts, and that pressure, people will no longer give in to that pressure to not speak out on Palestine. Something I think academics of all people will understand or do understand, but are afraid to speak out on now, is that any colonial entity needs to maintain power over sort of three levels of hierarchy. The first being obviously direct oppression of Palestinians, the second being institutions that are built to maintain oppression of Palestinians, and the third being cultural and psychological understanding of Palestine. And so the academia and media are both playing in that third sphere of our cultural and psychological understanding of what's happening in Palestine. So if we think about power being maintained on those three levels, academia could never be neutral, because as Sanabel was saying, these professors and academics are producing the knowledge that everyone is consuming, and how they understand and how they frame Palestine. So if we think about our constructions of what liberation could look like, of our understandings of history, and all of those things are built through institutions. And so if we understand academia in that third sort of sphere of maintaining power, then I think we'll reach a point where people understand it can no longer be neutral. And in fact, that the actions for the last 73 years of the vast majority of Western academics have been maintaining the oppression and colonization of Palestine.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let's move to the second big block, which is the role of the media. And I just wanted to give you a small context on the German coverage on Palestine in the recent time. Darius and I also made a small film about this, but we also analyzed some frames that were used in German media, especially the ones that are BBC, so Tagesschau. And it was really interesting to see after the Trump's announcement and the problems in Gaza and the demonstrations, you mostly heard the word radical Islamic Hamas, terrorism, Islamism. So Palestinians were always framed with this particular notion. And also the new one is now militant Palestinians. So all Palestinians are framed as militant Palestinians. Of course, there is a certain, on the coverage in Germany, there's a certain background, and it's important. There's the Staatsräson or raison d'etat. So, of course, there's this notion that you shouldn't question the right for Israel to exist. However, it's really interesting that even now there has been not so much of a shift. There was the first time now in German, in a German talk show, Malbret Illner, where they introduced where they had a Palestinian or half Palestinian person, Malcolm Ohanwe, who was able to speak for a little time and discuss. But the interesting thing was he couldn't get the last word. He was silenced in the end because he wanted to answer. And the person they sat on the other chair for the discussion was, it turns out now, was an Islam-hating person who was also working there, Konstantin Schreiber, even Kantara and the left newspaper Taz also pointed out that in his new book or novel, he actually wrote about how Germany is being Islamized, and of course it's fictional, but this shows a clear pattern, of course, of how Palestinians, if they get a voice now, which is kind of positive to see, that they have this notion of still not getting a big enough stage to talk. And this was the exception so far. So do you see that in the US? Is there a shift? Or do you also see no difference from the past and now? Maybe Leah or Sanabel?
I think maybe Leah can speak more closely on that, since she's
Sure.
in the field, definitely.
Yeah, and I'm also curious, Sanabel, about the context in Canada as well from when you were in university there, because I see in the US a shift beginning to happen. But I think, what I really appreciate about the context you gave, Sabri, is an understanding of how far we are from any sort of anti-racist understanding of what's happening in Palestine. And that's because, Amal Bashara, who's an anthropologist at Tufts University here in Boston, and a Palestinian academic, has written on this a lot, that in the context of Palestine, Palestinian knowledge producers, so actual Palestinians who specialize in media, journalism, and those sort of things, have been labeled as what she calls epistemological others. So basically, it's this idea that if you're Palestinian, you are inherently sort of dirtied by your identity, and you're biased, and you can't speak to what's happening because you're a Palestinian. And obviously this entire notion is rooted in white supremacy and in racism, in the same way that for a long time, and still, the Black liberation movement is struggling to be able to be seen as authorities on their own lived experiences in the US. The same thing is happening for Palestinians, where they'll bring in an Israeli media specialist or a white American specialist to speak on Palestinian lived experience, because Palestinians themselves have been labeled as so untrustworthy of being able to speak about what they've endured and experienced in their own lives, or what they have professional credentials to speak to as well. So, this also impacts obviously Palestinian academics and scholars and specialists. That is kind of the mountain we're climbing in beginning to shift the tides on Palestine and mainstream media's understanding of it. I do believe we're beginning to get there, though. Particularly, again, I said earlier, I've been comparing a lot 2014 to 2021 in terms of how the US mainstream media has covered what's happening in Palestine. And there's a marked and very significant shift. We're far, far from where I think we need to be in terms of mainstream understandings of what's happening. We're not at a colonial understanding of Palestine, but we're certainly getting closer, I think, in the mainstream media. And we see this both in who's invited to speak about Palestinian experiences, and more we see Palestinian experts being brought to even, mainstream news sources like CNN. Noura Erakat, for example, who's a Palestinian human rights lawyer and activist and advocate, she often will, be welcomed into media spaces that might still be a hostile conversation, but at least she's able to, use her voice in those spaces. So that's a shift, again, not where I would want us to be, but certainly getting better. And I also see that both social media and alternative media outlets are really pushing the mainstream media on this. So again, something that we had in 2014, but not to the same level of strength and influence, is social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. And on those forums, Palestinians can really create platforms for themselves, and have forced some of these more traditional knowledge producers, like mainstream media outlets, to take them seriously. If we look at what has been happening in Sheikh Jarrah, both Mohammed and Mona al-Kurd have become wildly popular over social media, and people trust them because they're videotaping, recording live, tweeting live their experiences about what they're seeing and having happened to them and their family members and their neighbors in Sheikh Jarrah. And people see that and understand that those voices are being kept out. And so as they get more and more momentum, then the CNNs and the MSNBCs and the New York Timeses of the world are forced to take them more seriously. But that started, even several years ago, more slightly more alternative or more progressive outlets like The Atlantic, for example, in the US, were recognizing and giving some platform to those voices. So I think both this combination of social media getting more traction, and when people turn to social media, they're often turning away from their print and online subscriptions. So there's also an element of mainstream media feeling like they're competing with these knowledge producers on social media, and having to include them in order to keep up. So I think that there's a role there in those alternative news and knowledge production outlets to push mainstream media. But I also think that as that happens, there's an effort to silence those alternative outlets as well. Like we've seen on social media in the last month, Instagram, for example, was deleting almost every single social media post that was going to Instagram stories, specifically by Mohammed al-Kurd. In my organizing circles, everyone who shared Palestinian activism stories, those had been deleted. So there is a censorship and erasure that often comes as a backlash. But then when with enough people crowdsourced and getting involved, and then that itself can even be overtaken. There were campaigns to stop that censorship. And so I think there's this kind of like ebb and flow, a little bit of like a tug between the mainstream outlets and the alternative social media and alternative outlets. But I do see that, overall, the more Palestinian voices are actually taking power and platforms for themselves and forcing mainstream medias to respect them, basically.
Yeah, definitely. Just like to add to what Leo was saying, like exactly like and this I think goes back to what I was saying at the beginning, the fact that people are now able to, like every single person with a phone and an internet connection kind of can establish their own their own platform instead of mainstream media. And I feel like there's been a migration from mainstream media to those social media accounts by a lot of people. In Canada, I haven't been reading too closely from Canada specifically, but what I have seen is that, you can see that there's no big shift in the kind of rhetoric that they use. But I also think that, this is really has to do with the fact that Canada also is, it colonized all the areas it had, and there is a massive population of Indigenous people that Canada is trying to silence. And even, with what was happening in Palestine, you saw that a lot of Indigenous groups, like on Instagram, Canadian Indigenous group were, sharing widely, and they were very vocal about the Palestinian struggle because it's mirrored in Canada as well. So I feel like, I'm sure also with the US, but maybe, I don't know, I feel it more with Canada, is that in order to be able to talk about Palestine, you're going to have to confront your own bloody history. Canada killed 99% of the Indigenous population, more than 100 million people were killed, so that they can, establish a Canada. So I feel like this is really, really deeply rooted in Canada's own colonial history.
So I'm also asking as a journalist, what do you think are the obstacles for better journalism? Because like when I compare conventional journalism and social media journalism right now on the topic, it's really different. There are so many, the quality is really changing. Also, like a few years ago, Instagram was always connected to like short stories, funny pictures, and that was basically it. And now it's really informative, like kind of infotainment program. And so where do you see that in the future? Is there, would that make it easier for journalists to report, or? Yeah.
Actually, I feel like maybe at first glance it might seem unrelated, but I feel like with what happened with COVID, the fact that people couldn't be in newsrooms and they had to kind of have this journalism from the private space rather than the professional or public space has kind of allowed this transition into a more kind of a more personal, laid-back journalism without, of course, affecting, the quality of journalism. But I feel like what people have been doing in order to do that, I think recently there's been a wide list of journalists. I think it's called, like, the title was "We Have Failed," and it's got hundreds of journalists who have actually signed saying that they would want more, like a fairer coverage in the future about what's happening in Palestine. So I feel like with covering, like we talk about the media, we talk about academia as, these separate entities, But at the end of the day, we're working in those entities. We are, building them. So I feel like once it comes from within, then that will be the change. Like when journalists come and say, to the outlet that they work for, that, this is not fair. We've been there, we've seen what's happening, and you can't really continue to censor. And once they keep pushing for that, then that will inevitably change. Especially right now, I feel like a lot of mainstream media are kind of, they're scared about the fact that people don't see them as credible sources anymore. And, once this happens, people will completely move away from that, and they will find more alternative forms of journalism. And I feel like this is also very important, to kind of constantly have these grassroots organizations, this independent funding for independent media, and to actually consult those sources instead of just consult the mainstream ones and take their word, as the ultimate truth. So yeah, I feel like, this is changing, it's happening. And I feel like also the fact that there was a lot of footage with the most recent attack on Gaza, and what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah, of journalists actually suffering, just like normal citizens. So we can't ask those journalists who have experienced, the subjugation firsthand, to be neutral, because they actually experienced the fact that it wasn't. Yeah, I feel like with more pressure, with more funding for independent media, and more inclusion of voices, then things will get better, hopefully. And just on the idea that the whole both sides thing, I find it very ironic, because for almost 70 years now, the other side has been completely invisible. So why is it that now, once this side, the Palestinian side, is gaining some visibility, it's not a full visibility, just some, then we're going to attack it and be like, what about the other side? I just feel like it's unfair, because we have, there's systems of oppression at play. There's an indigenous versus a settler colonial system. There's a form of apartheid. There's, ethnic cleansing. So I think we really need to go back to what we think about both sides, unless, the idea of both sides has become so comfortable for us that we just we ask for it whenever we feel that the situation might cause us to confront our own biases, which, a bias that's directly subjugating an entire people.
Yeah, I really want to underscore what you just said about the need for independent media sources and independent funding. I think, to my earlier point, I think this, there's a long history of independent media being kind of the sole bearers of truth on more colonial, controversial, or issues that relate to deep systems of oppression. And I think the same is obviously true on Palestine. And I've personally had lots of experiences where I might reach out to mainstream media outlets, and they'll reject a piece that is too biased, too inflammatory from a Palestinian perspective, but then a more alternative outlet will pick it up and actually be very encouraging of that. And very supportive of that perspective. And I think that's because a lot of these mainstream outlets are really still deeply entrenched in this racist idea of this racist myth, really, of objectivity. And there's so much unlearning that needs to happen to understand how objectivity has been wielded to actually defend and shield white supremacy from criticism throughout our history, even in the US. And I think it's particularly ironic for me to see some mainstream outlets like the New York Times, for example, had an entire segment on their involvement as a news outlet in perpetuating racism and combating slavery abolition movements, and really a very grotesque history when it comes to racial justice in the US. And they've actually begun to uncover that and make it public in the interest of transparency and an understanding that they were on the wrong side of history. But at the same time, we see that exact outlet really misses the mark on Palestine most of the time. There have been a few good articles that have come out, in recent years, but so that irony to me is very stark. But also, I'm hopeful that is the place we'll be in the future, where outlets will understand that they actually played a role in perpetuating mythologies around Palestine, because again, if we think about the context of it, all relates to the context of colonialism versus the context of conflict. And right now, most mainstream media outlets are playing in this arena where they understand what's happening in Palestine to be part of a conflict, or, this both sidesism. And in that framing, there's this elevation of objectivity, meaning we give Palestinians 10 seconds to speak and then get an Israeli narrator. So it's like both the idea of objectivity is not even balanced, and the entire idea is not compatible with an understanding of Palestine through a colonial lens. And so, again, like to our earlier conversation, I don't think we're there yet, but I do strongly believe that a lot of these outlets will look back on the issue of Palestine, hopefully quite soon, and see it the way that they understand the perpetuation of racism in the US, the perpetuation of racist mythologies about indigenous people in the US, or perpetuation about, the apartheid movement in South Africa. And all of those things are obviously far from being fully realized, but I think there's still quite a lot of ground to gain on the Palestine issue of understanding the role that the media plays in creating knowledge that actually maintains colonialism.
And sorry, just to add one more thing, Leah, to what you're saying, definitely, because now that when you were talking, I actually remembered that The Guardian, about a month ago, they issued this long feature basically discussing, pieces or articles that they actually regret, features that have been published over the years and that they really regret really supporting or talking about. Of course, racism is definitely on there, but they also talk about regretting their support, for the Balfour Declaration, and really kind of championing it the way they did. And of course, this caused an outrage among many Israeli outlets. But like you're saying, I feel like now that so much time has passed, hopefully, not a lot of time also will pass, that these news outlets have become aware of their role, and that the neutrality that you mentioned, like you said, it doesn't exist. It's not how it is. And I feel like this can be applied to, like the positivism that we see in academia. In order to talk about Palestinians, you need to be proof. You need to have proof. You need to be rational. You need to see both sides. You need to, basically completely obliterate your identity or positionality, and the history that caused you to become, a refugee, or to lose someone, because of the Israeli occupation, or house, or space, or even a sense of identity. So I feel like this revisiting will, in the future, increase, hopefully.
Since you were talking about identity, I also wanted to know the importance for Palestinians of identity. Is there a line where you should also be careful, just asking naive about identity? Or do you think it is really an important stance? Because in Germany, there's also, of course, the discourse of identity politics being important, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement, such things. Of course, isn't it not completely comparable, but there's also people who claim, okay, identity politics could also mean having like excluding other people, but this is mostly asked nowadays by people who are in a privileged situation. Do you see that as well?
Yeah, I feel like with Palestinians, they're very acutely aware that sometimes their very existence can be interpreted or translated into something extremely dangerous. and horrid, and this is anti-Semitism or hating Jewish people. And I feel like, which is of course not the case, and I feel like a lot of people now, a lot of activists who are Palestinians, the way they identify their Palestinianness is through Jewish solidarity. Like a lot of Jewish people now are dissenting, and they're presenting themselves as anti-Zionist or anti-Israel Jews. And I feel like what's happening now, which is very important, is that a lot of Palestinians are kind of wedding their struggle with Jewish people who are actually becoming advocates for the Palestinian cause. However, I find that it's very problematic, whether in Germany or outside, that being pro-Palestinian can automatically mean something else. And I feel like even though there's been so much effort by the Palestinian movement, and not even Palestinian movement, just Palestinian identities, individuals expressing their identity, is to ensure people that, this is not the case, and that what they're struggling against is a colonial system that is an extension of England, an extension of English policies, and an extension of all of that. So even though it's amazing that, Palestinians are very vocal about what they are and what they are not, I feel like it's unfair that they're automatically believed to be, haters of, so I feel like it's very unfair. But I hope that, in the future, again, this goes back to the importance of having those conversations. People will realize that you can absolutely be supportive of, Jewish life and culture and struggle and everything, and be pro-Palestinian, that both are not mutually exclusive. So I feel like once this conversation starts, surfacing, and once people start actually having this difficult conversation, especially for Germany, then something can happen. Because, Germany also needs to confront the fact that being silent right now will mean that in 50 years, there's going to be a massive regret, for not really attempting to talk about this and to open up the space for a real, frank, and difficult conversation to happen. Like, of course, it's difficult, but, it needs to happen, with everything that's happening, especially now.
Yeah.
Yeah, go on.
No,
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, because we are already at the last question now. But Leah, you have the right to answer this one. Because Leah, you also mentioned colonialism. So maybe let's get back to the issue of decolonization, and with a very important question, which is striking lots of Palestinians. So what is actually there to do for Palestinians or supporters for fundamental rights for Palestinians? Because right now, or since a lot of time, it's like armed resistance is totally condemned, and peaceful protests, such as BDS, for example, they are labeled as anti-Semitic in Germany, at least, for instance. So, and I know, like at university in Germany, Frantz Fanon is like an intellectual who's widely read, and we discussed so much of his theses about the progress of decolonization and all those different steps, which also historically have been taken. And how would you, describe this dilemma, kind of, that anything the Palestinians are doing is kind of wrong, and there's no real chance to escape this?
Yeah, I mean, so I'll just briefly on the identity politics thing, I'll just say that I think it's identity politics is an inherently limited project, I think, because it can in a way perpetuate this like liberal idea of diversity for diversity's sake. So like if we have 5 people in a room, all from different backgrounds, then we've achieved racial justice. And as we know, that's not truly how we get to equity and equality and justice. And so I think in the context of Palestine, that can be quite limiting. If we think about, oh, we have a Palestinian speak, we have an Israeli speak, or something like that, as we talked about earlier, that plays into this mythology of objectivity. But what I do think is important is to take leadership from people with lived experience on the issue of Palestine. And so I think there's this delicate dance between elevating the principles of solidarity, anti-Zionism, and liberation struggle for the principles in and of themselves, and not for some veneer of diversity, but then also at the end of the day, listening to Palestinians and their calls for justice, which I think brings me to your question, Darius, about what is there to do. For me, the most important thing to do as a diaspora Palestinian, someone whose family has not been able to return since 1948, is to operate in the context that I'm in, to confront racism mythologies about racist ideas about what Palestine is, and to dismantle those racist mythologies. So, concretely, I think that looks like having difficult conversations about Zionism in communities and what that means in the context of Palestine, and how we can be anti-Zionists as part of a struggle for justice and a movement for justice for all peoples, and how anti-Semitism is absolutely unacceptable, and the struggle against anti-Semitism is actually part of the struggle for justice and struggle to dismantle white supremacy. So I think having these difficult conversations about what upholds white supremacy, anti-Semitism being historically one of the main things that does uphold white supremacy, and then we need to look at the ways that colonialism in Palestine also upholds white supremacy, and how we can have those difficult conversations and disentangle those things so that we can actually move forward with a more ethical, or a conversation with integrity that actually has an understanding of what's happened, that's true to the history of what's happened in Palestine for 73 years. We've, in the US for the last 73 years, as long as Palestinians have been colonized, there have been active efforts to erase that history of colonization, erase and deny that the Nakba ever happened, that the Nakba is ongoing, to deny the existence of settlements, of occupation, of oppression, and all of these things. And so, as Palestinians have been enduring for 73 years, Americans and people in the Western world have been being fed racist mythologies about why Palestinians either, aren't experiencing what they're experiencing, deserve to experience whatever they do experience, or why, even if they were experiencing those things, no one in the West should speak up about it or take a stance on it. And so I think, getting to the root of how we've gotten to a understanding of Palestine that's so far from the reality, I think, to me, that's where I see the diaspora and people in solidarity being really critical. Obviously, of course, also supporting the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement that has been directly called for by Palestinian activists on the ground. I think that's a really critical foray into confronting Zionism and pro-Israel mythologies that are in our communities, to begin to understand what companies, what institutions are complicit in the occupation in Palestine. That's a great way to start having those conversations. But to me, the most critical barrier is a barrier of a true understanding of what's happening in Palestine. And I think that's the first thing that we would need to dismantle and really get to a true understanding before we can, begin to be in a place where the US, for example, would sanction Israel and stop sending $3.8 billion in military aid every year. That right now is completely untenable because most of the people in power and making decisions have been fed 73 years of racist mythologies about Palestine. So to me, in diaspora, I see, disentangling, dismantling and sort of dissolving those mythologies to be my primary goal.
Okay, thank you very much. We would move to some questions we have from the chat, maybe two, and then we might wrap up. The first one would be towards Sanabel, which is, do you think Palestine should have a more prominent role in the university curriculum and also in research in order to generate more detailed knowledge and bring it into focus and context? Or
sorry, do I reply now or do you want to collect?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, definitely. I think this is the first step towards achieving that, before people, go to universities and, get into that environment, it's good to kind of have an education before that. And on that, actually, I think, it was in the UK, they have recently withdrawn the curriculum that they've decided to give students, because the previous one kind of didn't mention Palestinians at all, or it antagonized them. And this other one, I think, Zionist organizations in the UK were saying that, it's anti-Semitic because they spoke about Palestinians. So now they withdraw them again. So definitely, I feel like education is absolutely the first way to do that, and to kind of have those conversations. However, this has not been the case, because many students also in the UK who, I think there was a student who raised a flag or said "Free Palestine," they were grounded, and this happened to several students. So, and you have a lot of teachers who are very much concerned that you're teaching the children to be afraid and terrified of standing up with a certain people from a very young age, and they kind of think about the repercussions of that. So yes, definitely, I think this is an extremely important step. And with having a curriculum that paints the Palestinians as human beings, that does not antagonize or erase them. And actually on that, there was an article about, there's a website, it's called Facing History and Ourselves. And basically it's an education website that provides teachers with very valuable tools of education and all of that. However, the article says that the Palestinians on that website, that's supposed to be for teachers and educators, are completely absent. And this is extremely problematic, because once the child, all the, children of the world think that Palestinians either never existed or are completely, they're not there anymore, then this is very problematic, because, they're going to grow up with that ideology, because it is an ideology of othering or erasing the Palestinian. So yeah, with education, definitely that'll be, the first step towards remedying that.
Okay, yeah, there's another question directed at the two of you. Do you feel the need for discussion workshops, training people in solidarity with Palestine and defending themselves from allegations of being anti-Semitic, etc.? Because this might make it possible for supporters of the cause to be a lot more vocal about the topic in their universities, institutions, politics, etc. What do you think about that? Leah, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I think there absolutely should be more conversations and workshops about that. I know just from personal anecdotal experience, talking with the non-Palestinians who really want to get more engaged and want to be in solidarity, but are genuinely deeply afraid of those accusations and what repercussions they might have, on their professional lives. We have in the US, but I think globally, a website called Canary Mission that blacklists activists and people who speak up on Palestine. So there's still, there's this very real fear of doxing, of having your personal information, posted or associated. And I think, more and more those sort of websites and efforts are being discredited as racist, as they are. But I think absolutely, like, having more conversations and workshops about how both to speak up about Palestine, how to understand the situation in Palestine, but also how to be an activist, how to, be an advocate in your own spaces. And I think another thing that's really important that I would just add to that is this can and should happen everywhere. So it's not just for academics. It's not just for historians on Palestine. It's not just for journalists. It's for doctors and nurses. It's for teachers. It's for servers, like in, customer service, et cetera. It's in every, work environment or community space that you might be in, interrogating and understanding, the role that you play in perpetuating racist mythologies around Palestine is really critical. And again, in other movements, we've seen that happen. We saw, for example, in the US last summer, in every sphere, there were conversations about Black Lives Matter. And obviously there's still a long, long ways to go in, you know, the movement for Black liberation in the US, but it was beginning to, you know, have those sort of spaces where people can talk about within solidarity circles or within, you know, just white people talking about how to talk about race, you know, and things like that. And there were so many resources that were produced about how to have those conversations, how to be an advocate in your own spheres, in your own community. And I think it's really essential that everyone feel equipped to do that. And I also think there's a way that can be done without relying only on Palestinians to, you know, basically hold the hands of people in solidarity and allyship. I think there's again a delicate way to take leadership from the Palestinian community and platform their perspectives, and also feeling empowered as someone in solidarity to do your own work for the liberation of Palestine, and to take up BDS, to have those conversations like you all are hosting now. So I think there's absolutely space for it. And I think that everyone, regardless of their identity, should feel empowered to be having conversations about Palestine through an anti-colonial framework.
Do you have like personal experience with these doxing websites? You mentioned the Canary mission, I think. I mean, how is it like? And I can't even imagine how they work and how they going on with this.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, I have been doxxed on that website, and I've been you know, doxxed in a few other ways. And I think for me as a Palestinian, and Sanabel, I'm curious for your experience in academia. To some degree, it's to be expected. As Sanabel said earlier, our very identity is political and often seen as toxic, you know, even if we don't say anything. But in my personal experience, you know, I do think it was scary at first, but then understanding that any place that would believe, like, blatantly, in my perspective, racist framings of my activism is not a place I want to be. So, you know, I think that was an easier decision for me to make because I'm Palestinian and this issue is so close to my heart. But I do think for people who, you know, speak out on a variety of issues, this feeling that if you get doxxed about Palestine, all anyone will know about you is your work on Palestine, that can feel daunting to people. I really wish, you know, that wasn't the case. And I wish Palestine wasn't such a toxic issue. And I think, to be honest, like there's a level of bravery we all, I think, need to feel empowered to sort of overcome some of those threats and blackmailing, frankly, from the Zionist movement. But as I said, they're, you know, with every passing moment, they're being more and more discredited about how racist they are, painting everyone who's Arab or Muslim as an Islamist, you know, and all of these things that are, again, blatantly racist lies. But again, yeah, I mean, it's real that people can be afraid, and I certainly was at first. But I think as you know, as the conversation shifts in Palestine as a whole, those sort of efforts will be delegitimized.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Just yeah, sorry, just to add, Leah, definitely, like what you said was, yeah, definitely on point, because I feel like once you're personally involved, then, you know, like, yeah, fine, I'll pay the price, because there will be a price to be paid for that. And I feel like, you know, being aware of your identity as a Palestinian and what, you know, Palestinians have gone through, then it's kind of like, it's still very difficult, but it's easier than, you know, kind of adopting a cause kind of from the outside and being reluctant to pay the price, which is why so many people are silent.
Okay, very good. Just if you have some last breath left, we have like one last statement which you might comment on. Maybe I find this one point very important, and I just read out what that person wrote. Journalism is extremely important to distribute a non-colonial message, but academia is likewise important to open intellectual space for new comprehensive views. Just an hour ago, today's Ringvorlesung on 10 years Arab Spring, this time Israel in focus. There, the dominant theme of two-state solution for Palestine was buried, and new views based on Palestine population needs, protests in conjunction with Israel protests were developed. So universities can step beyond journalists reporting facts and options by anticipating future developments and and putting them into discussions. I find especially this point of talking about two-state solution very interesting, because in Germany it's that way, that mostly one-state solution is not a topic, of course, because they don't want to deny Israel the right to exist. But there are ways, even in Omri Böhm, an interesting writer, also had ideas of a one-state solution by a binational state, with an idea which is called Haifa Republic. Do you think it is worth talking rather of a one-state solution than a two-state solution, or what would be your point on that?
So should I go first, Leo, or yeah? I feel like of course I'm not in a position to make those decisions, and but this is just my personal impression as a Palestinian, but also someone who's read some history on the topic. The idea of a two-state solution will not work, because it will not work on ground, first, because first you have the fact that we're going to give Palestinians those tiny strips of land, but then we're going to barricade them. We're going to have apartheid walls around them. When they misbehave, we're going to shoot them, commit massacres against them, and not to mention that the crawling of the settlements, no matter what. Like right now in Sheikh Jarrah, you have people literally kicking people out who have been there for hundreds of years, because some people from the US have come and they want a free house. This is how it works. And the one-state solution, I think what people I get why especially people in Germany are terrified of the idea. But the thing with a one-state solution is that it will not, because you have this idea of where will the Jewish people go then, but the thing is, before 1948, the Jewish people, the Muslim people, the Christian people all lived together, because no people were above any other. Everyone was equal. So once people are able to understand that you can, just live with someone without feeling superior to them, without having a right to, kill their family, demolish their houses, kick them out whenever you feel like, then this is a conversation that can happen. But I feel like just saying we're going to give them a two-state solution, and also what about the millions of refugees who were forcibly expelled from their homes, including myself and Leah as well? What if they want to come back? How would we have a two-state solution if there will be no right of return, which is a fundamental human right, in the Palestinian case? So I feel like for sure it's good to think about options, but also there is a very practical matter at hand. There is the lives of millions of people, and there is a state that was based on ethnic cleansing. And I know it's uncomfortable for people, but this is what it is. So really kind of just blindly following a certain idea of what things should be like, without really seeing the human beings who are suffering because of this is it's very unfair, to say the least, and it's just perpetuating a criminal way of doing things, which shouldn't be.
Yeah, I think that's so important to understand that the two-state solution discourse, which is a discourse that the media reports on, but that is absolutely created in academia and is really put on a pedestal in conversations. People write whole dissertations on one element of the two-state solution, and all of this theater around the two-state solution is based in deeply problematic structures of supremacy and neoliberalism. And the reason I say that is because and I've said this in previous conversations that I've had, which is even the question, do you think Israel has a right to exist, is a weird question, right? What state has a right to exist, as a state? I think, that is neoliberalism in its final and most distilled form, is this idea that a governmental entity, but not people, have a right to exist, right? That the Israeli state has more of a right to exist than millions of Palestinian people worldwide have a right to live and be free. And so like, I think, understanding and disentangling the idea that a state is connected to a religion or people of that religion, I think is really important, because at the end of the day, a state is just an assemblance of institutions. And in the case of Palestine, those institutions are based on a system of supremacy that dehumanizes Palestinians and puts them as second-class citizens, or actually, as subjects of colonialism. And so, like, I think, the entire conversation about a two-state solution is kind of in this, like, what I would call like a fairyland that's built on neoliberalism, that is not really based in any reality, that humanizes everyone who's living in Palestine, throughout historic Palestine. And to Sanabel's point, my grandparents were born in Lid and Jaffa in Palestine. Both of those places are in what we call 48 Palestine and what's now the state of Israel. So when we think about this idea of what a two-state solution is, we can look to decolonial studies, which give us the principle of land back. Like if there's a colonial entity, decolonization requires giving sovereignty over the land back to the indigenous people, and for them to decide what fate to build, what state or government or way of collectivizing themselves to build with all those people who live there. And I think even just saying that in the public sphere often gets smeared as some idea of something that it isn't, about pushing people into the sea or dismantling the only Jewish state, when in the reality is that a state is, again, nothing more than an assemblances of institutions. And so I think what's really important is talking about personhood and, people's right to liberation, people's right to exist, instead of elevating this discourse about statehood, which ultimately leaves the person behind.
Yeah, really inspiring. Thank you very much. Thank you, Sanabel. Thank you, Leah. Thank you very much, everyone, for watching and taking part in the discussion. There's more events and panel discussions coming up in the course of the next weeks and months. If you just follow the CNMS Facebook page or also on the Instagram page, we will keep you posted. And Leah and Sanabel, are there ways to follow you, maybe on Instagram or Twitter or anything?
Yeah, I have my Instagram and email also, like both work. Should I? Okay.
I just put it in the chat.
Okay.
Yeah,
you could just say it. That's the least we could do. So thank you very much. You all joined we just organized it ourselves. So unfortunately, we couldn't give you any university money or anything else so that we could organize it that fast. So thank you so much for joining and being part of this. And we hope you all enjoyed it. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And have a nice day. Have a good night.
Bye,
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a great day. Great night.
Thanks.
Bye.
You too. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.